Today I'm going to wrap up our series on the feeding of the 5,000 by discussing two more undesigned coincidences, several more indicators of independence, and the miraculous implications of the stories of the feeding of the 5,000 and of their numerous indicators of authenticity. One interesting undesigned coincidence concerns the number of the men who were fed. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four, mention that 5,000 men, or approximately 5,000 men, were fed. And they all use the word for men, the specific Greek word indicating men as opposed to women. In fact, Matthew explicitly brings that out. He says men besides women and children. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't give us a very good indication of how the disciples would have gotten an estimate of the number of men as opposed to the women and children. Obviously, if the story is just made up, then you could say somebody just made up a big number and that everybody else copied it. But why specifically men as opposed to women and children, and how realistically could they have known that? If they just looked out at a big crowd and made a guess about how many people were there, that wouldn't separate the men from the women. In Matthew, it says that Jesus fed the crowds and that he told the crowds to recline. And then it says that 5,000 men were fed. Well, that's not very helpful. In Mark, we get a little bit more of a hint because it mentions having them recline in groups of 50 and 100. But once again, Mark doesn't say who exactly reclined in groups of 50 and 100. In Luke, we find a mention of his having these people sit down, and it mentions there were 5,000 men, and then he said they sat down in groups of smaller numbers, but Luke doesn't actually make it clear whether it was these people or just the men, or who it was who sat down. Only when we get to John, we find that John says that Jesus said to tell the people to sit down. That's a more general term. But then it says, and the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Now, this is also realistic because it's going to take a while to distribute the food, and so having all the little kids sit down during this time could be difficult, making them all sit still and so forth. So the men, as representatives of their family, sit down. That fits with Jewish culture. They recline, and then the disciples can come around to these separate groups, and they can ask how much food they need, and the men can get that food. The women can be free to run around after the children. So this all fits together quite realistically as a means of distribution, but you have to put together all four Gospels to get that, where John says that he said half the people reclined, but then it was the men specifically who sat down. Put that together with the mention of the groupings, and you can see how they could get a pretty good estimate of how many men were fed, and then say, besides women and children. Here's another one. This one is at a much broader level. It's not a coincidence specifically among the accounts of the feedings, but it includes a section that is found only in John's account of the feeding of the 5,000. We find in the Synoptic Gospels something that scholars like to call the messianic secret. And this is when Jesus will tell various people, his disciples, in one incident he tells the evil spirits, not to tell anyone that he's the Messiah. This is a little surprising because Jesus is always asking people to follow him, to be committed to him. He even asks the disciples, who do men say that I am? And so forth. But at the same time, he doesn't want people going out there and proclaiming that he's the Messiah. Scholars sometimes take this too far when they will say that in that case, the proclamations of deity that Jesus makes in John are unrealistic, because if he was hiding his messiahship, he would have so much the more tried to hide that he was God. I don't agree with that, and I'm going to deal with that in my book on John, forthcoming next spring. But it is true that there are places where people are told by Jesus, don't tell anyone that I'm the Messiah. When Jesus talks to the woman at the well, however, she mentions the Messiah, which the Samaritans also believed in some form, and Jesus says that he is the Messiah. He says that to her alone. Okay, what's the reason for this? How do we put all this together? Well, Craig Blomberg has noted that John's account of the feeding helps to explain the messianic secret. Because at the end of the feeding, they say, truly, this is the prophet who was to come into the world, and they're going to come and try to make him king by force. And as we've seen in our earlier videos, that's when Jesus decides to dismiss the multitudes and go up the mountain alone to pray, because he doesn't want to be an earthly king. We find elsewhere in John, when he's talking to Pilate, that he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So this helps to explain, especially in a hotbed area like Galilee of messianic expectation and fervor, why Jesus would not want to be known as the Messiah. This incident where they come and try to make him king by force helps to explain that. So on this broader level, John explains the so-called messianic secret found in the synoptics. I'd like to talk about a few more indicators of independence. Remember that these will be on top of all of the things that I've already talked about in earlier videos with undesigned coincidences, things that are found uniquely in one gospel. These are just more such indicators. John has quite a few of these. For example, only John tells about the boy with his lunch, which is connected in all of our minds, those of us who know the story well, that there's a little boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's only found in John. In the synoptics, it says that Jesus asks them how many loaves they have or how much food they have, and they say 5 and 2 fishes, but it doesn't mention that these were brought by a boy. Only John mentions that they were barley loaves. That fits with the time of year that's also mentioned in John near the Passover, but John does not stress that connection. Only John mentions that it was Andrew who brought the boy forward. There may be a connection in the fact that elsewhere John mentions that Andrew was also from Bethsaida. Might he have known this boy? We don't know. That's a conjecture. But in any event, only John mentions Andrew. He's clearly adding material that he's not getting from some, pre-existing synoptic oral tradition or from the synoptic accounts themselves. Well, you could say, yeah, everybody knows John has extra stuff. Well, how about this? More extra stuff from John. Only John mentions the other name of the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Tiberias, and we can confirm elsewhere that that was another name for it. That's a little external confirmation. Only John, in the immediately subsequent and connected story of the storm at sea, mentions how far they had rowed when they saw Jesus coming toward them. And he doesn't get hyper precise. He says about 25 or 30 stadia, but it's still more precise. The synoptics say they were in the middle of the sea, that being the Sea of Galilee, not the Mediterranean. These are indicators, and there are more of them that I'm going to talk about in my book on John, that he was not a landlubber, that he knew the Sea of Galilee, that he was comfortable with the sea, which of course fits with the traditional authorship of the Gospel of John by the fisherman John, the son of Zebedee. What about the synoptics? Well, only Matthew and Luke mention that Jesus healed the people on that day, earlier in the day. Mark doesn't mention that, so whatever else you may say, they're not getting it from Mark. Only Mark, among the synoptics, mentions where they landed. When they got back to the other side of the sea, he says they landed at Gennesaret. This fits with the fact that in John, it says when they set off toward Capernaum. Capernaum and Gennesaret are fairly close to one another, but they're not the same city. You could even regard that, if you wanted to, as a kind of undesigned coincidence, that they land over there near Capernaum, which is where they were heading to back from Bethsaida. Only Matthew tells a story about Peter, which is interesting since Peter was supposed to be Mark's source, but only Matthew tells the story, again in this subsequent connected account, of how when they see Jesus coming on the water, Peter says, bid me to come to you. And then he gets out of the boat and then he becomes afraid and Jesus has to grab him and reproves him for his lack of faith. Now, that, of course, is another miracle story. And the skeptic is going to say, well, Matthew just made that up and added it. It's not possible to prove that that's not true, and it is true that this adds another miraculous element to the wider story as a whole. But I think it would be worth considering the personality of Peter. I have an entire section of The Mirror or the Mask, also known as T-Mom, on the personality of Peter. So if you want to read more about that, get a hold of that. Peter's personality is very warm, very impulsive. He puts himself forward. He's like the kid in the class who raises his hand, but he does so out of love for Jesus. Then he finds that he can't keep up what he promised or what he was trying to do. Obviously, the most prominent example of this is when he says he'll never forsake Jesus, never deny Jesus on the night in which Jesus is betrayed, and then that's exactly what he does. I understand that from our modern perspective, it may not seem very surprising that we would find stories by different authors, different stories by different authors, that show a character in the same light. But I think we should remember that this was not an era of fanfic. This was not an era where you would have a canon version of a story or of a world building, and then other people would come along and do, a movie spin-off or a book spin-off or something like that, where they might be sort of nerdish about it and investigate the canon version and try to make the characters similar. That's all anachronistic. That kind of interconnected, carefully constructed fiction is a modern phenomenon, very much so. Moreover, these are pretty subtle indicators of character, and quite frankly, if you watch the same television show from one series and one season to the next, you will actually find incompatibilities in the portrayal of the characters. Or if you watch the movie version of something and read the book version of something, you will find inconsistencies, and you'll say, hey, why did they change that character? People talk about this all the time. So these kind of indicators of that warmth of personality by Peter, his impulsiveness, and yet his inability to deliver on what he's promising, those are actually very realistic, and they are, I think, indicators of authenticity. But here's another one that is even more subtle. Mark mentions the many coming and going. We talked about that in the previous video, and that they're crowded and Jesus takes them away from the crowds. And that kind of kicks off the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew, though his account of the feeding has a lot of verbal similarities to Mark's, mentions something else as the catalyst for Jesus to leave with his disciples. Both Matthew and Mark have just told the story of the death of John the Baptist. He was beheaded by Herod, and that apparently happened just before the feeding. And Matthew says, and when Jesus heard, he went away with his disciples. Heard what? Presumably heard of the death of John the Baptist. These motives are, of course, compatible. Jesus could be doing things, wanting to get away for more than one reason, and his disciples are observing, and they're drawing their own conclusions about what's kicking off, what's triggering his desire to leave. Peter can notice one thing, and Matthew can notice another. But Matthew didn't get that from Mark. Mark doesn't say when he heard, seeming to mean when he heard of the death of John the Baptist. Mark says there were many coming and going, so they did not have leisure to eat, and then they leave. So this appears to be Matthew adding something, and it's one of those subtle little things that really doesn't look like some kind of embellishment that you would just make up. It doesn't serve any apologetic purpose or have any special theological meaning. Luke mentions that Jesus and John the Baptist were kinsmen. That arises from Luke's infancy narrative. They appear to have been cousins of some kind because their mothers were kin to one another, Mary and Elizabeth. It looks like Jesus and John the Baptist had known one another before, and we find some exchanges between them in the Synoptic Gospels. Jesus was certainly capable of human grief at the death of his friends. In John, we find him weeping at the grave of Lazarus. So it's realistic and believable that when he heard of the death of his cousin John the Baptist, he wanted to go away from all of these crowds. So that's a nice little indicator of independence in Matthew. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the miraculous character of this event. What we've seen in all of these videos are indications that these four authors are talking about the same event, the same incident. It was an incident involving a large crowd. It was an incident that took place at a certain time of year. It was an incident where Jesus had a dialogue with his disciples about how they were going to feed all of them. It took place at a particular place and at a particular time of year and so forth. There are a lot of indicators of the authenticity of memory here, going back to those who were there, of some kind of real incident of Jesus with a crowd. If this was just another incident where Jesus was teaching, or if this were just a picnic where Jesus taught all day and then he's like, hey folks, get out your bag lunches, let's all sit down, I'm going to pray, and then they all eat the stuff they brought. Why would all four Gospels record it? It's quite clear that the reason that this was remembered and that it's recorded again and again is because of the amazing event, the miraculous feeding. That's what causes them to write it down. It's kind of a spectacular event, and yet it looks like it was a real event from all of these indicators of realism and truth. Moreover, if the external events happen, this isn't like some kind of healing miracle where we can say, well, maybe did the person recover on his own by some natural thing, some natural causes. If Jesus is standing there and he's passing out bread and the disciples are going in and out among these groups of 50 and 100 men reclining on the grass and asking them if they need more, coming back to Jesus, getting more bread, getting more fish, that's got to be a miracle. It's very hard to find a natural explanation of this. It's not like Jesus has wagon loads of bread and fish behind him that he's turning around and slipping to the disciples. So this is actually quite a strong confirmation of a miracle account in the Gospels. And that adds to the miraculous veracity of the Gospels, that even when they tell miracles, they aren't just making them up. And as we've seen, of course, there are undesigned coincidences in non-miraculous areas as well. But we shouldn't just automatically say, well, it's a miracle, I'm going to just set that aside, or go to some higher level and say, Jesus did things that caused people to drop their jaws in astonishment, but we cannot verify as historians whether he did any particular one of these things. This is a particular one of these things, and we find it confirmed in multiple ways. I'd like to conclude with the words of J.J. Blunt. Blunt was the scholar in the 19th century who wrote a whole book on undesigned coincidences in the Bible. And he has this to say about the feeding of the 5,000. Here again, then, I maintain we have strong indications of veracity in the case of a miracle itself, and I leave it to others who may have ingenuity and inclination for the task to weed out the falsehood of the miracle from the manifest reality of the circumstances which attend it, and to separate fiction from fact, which is in the very closest combination with it. I couldn't have said it better myself. Be sure to like this video, share this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you can get notifications when new video content comes out. I hope next time to start a series on the infancy accounts and Jesus' virgin birth. Thanks for watching.